Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and you're listening to the latest chapter of Tales from the Triverse. And today's chapter is called The Last Flight of the Beagle, Part 1. Space, in transit between the Moon and Max Earth. 2550, March, Earth time. Any moment, Clark's bones would shatter, his lungs would collapse, his chest would crumble. First his heart would be crushed, which wasn't too bad, as it would save him the embarrassment of his guts being squeezed out of him, while his brain bled from his ears. At least, that's how it felt. The Beagle was still accelerating, the thrust pinning them to their seats and compressing their bodies. All sense of time had gone, either from the pressure or from whatever it was that Justin had injected into them. Clark might have been in that seat for a year, or a minute. He had no way of knowing. His entire universe was the curve of the seat, its padding, the straps holding him in place, the head brace that was saving him from a broken neck as the ship rocked and shuddered. It was very different to the leisurely cruise on the way out. This time they were running, although he didn't know exactly why or from what. What small part of his brain still functioned wanted to ask questions, but his tongue felt huge and awkward in his mouth, and it took every effort not to swallow it. His vision was smeared, the lights of the cabin unpleasantly bright, and he wondered if it was possible to have an eyeball pop during extreme acceleration. He didn't even groan as to make a noise, would have required more air in his lungs than he could manage, and his throat was constricted and tight. And he thought he'd disliked space travel before. Justin must have anticipated questions as their voice blared out from the cabin speakers, barely audible above the sounds of a vehicle being pushed beyond its limits. "We are being pursued," they said. "The Beagle is not equipped with advanced sensory equipment, so I'm unable to acquire a clear reading on the ship's identity. I would assume, given its speed, that it is a megaship. Most likely, probably better." The rogue AI. Shit. "There is nowhere in the solar system that the Beagle could successfully evade it. My own ship is still many hours away and will not be able to assist in time." Even above all the pain and gasping for breath, Clark felt his gut tightening, a panic rising. He'd seen the results of AIs fighting each other, back in London years earlier, when a shard of Justin had been torn to pieces and bled out on the floor of a dirty flat in Plaistow. That had been host bodies, humanoid robot shards of the superintelligences, rather than the real things. This was different, and he didn't have a good handle on what a megaship actually was, as they kept to themselves and were rarely seen. He wondered if humans had ever been hunted by an AI. "I have calculated a route to Earth at the maximum burn possible, while keeping you all alive. Our pursuer does not have such considerations and will therefore travel faster. As such, we will not have the usual luxury of a flip and burn to decelerate on our approach to the planet. While the Beagle's compute power is limited, I have devised an approach trajectory that will utilize the Earth's atmosphere as an extreme air brake." That sounded dangerous. Clark wanted to ask if there was another way, any other options at all. "This is an untested manoeuvre with the Beagle's class of ship. I will endeavour to keep the ship intact." The AI sounded almost jovial, a fun experiment. Clark had to remind himself that it was trying to save their lives. It was absurd that his life had come to this, that he was in this situation. He'd dreamt as a young man of having a heroic purpose. As a middle-aged man, he'd wished for any form of purpose, heroic or not. As he'd approached retirement, he'd resigned himself to living out his days without motivation, going through the motions until he stopped. There was a time when retirement felt like the end. He couldn't see past it, and had started eyeing beams in his home, testing their strength and height. Why bother carrying on? He'd never decided if it was a serious thought. Then John Callahan had died. Had it really taken his death for Clark to find a reason to live? There was a jolting, horrendous slide to the side, Clark feeling the sensation of his brain shifting inside his head. "We are being fired upon," said Justin. "I am making an invasive response. The Beagle is not as fast as probably better, but it is nevertheless a highly agile super-yacht." The most likely scenario was that they were all going to die. 4 Londoners and a Palanese princess blown to pieces in outer space, in a dimension not their own. It wasn't an end he'd ever imagined, or ever could have imagined, yet every decision he'd ever made had led him to that moment. Panels began peeling from the ceiling and walls and flying across the cabin, where he heard them crash into the back wall. A cupboard behind the bar fell open, and a bottle of something fell out, its neck shattering on the worktop. Liquid sprayed across the room, spatters hitting his face. Wine. He hoped the others were faring better than him, that they hadn't been hit by any of the debris. He wished he could somehow shove Lola, and Nisha, and Zoltan, and the princess, shove them all through a portal, send them somewhere where they'd be safe, and could live quiet, long lives. They'd all been denied that. Clark was an old man, felt like an old man. He didn't give two shits and a fuck what happened to him, not anymore. He'd only been doing any of this, sticking with the SDC, for Callahan's sake. He owed him that much. And then, at some point, he'd been doing it for Lola, too. He'd not intended to make friends. It was easier to go without, but fuck it. It was what it was. Clenching his jaw against the pressure, feeling his jowls rippling and shaking, he stared straight ahead at the wall and focused on his breathing. In and out, slowly, painfully, each inhalation a monumental effort. His heart, which had been hammering away, slowed its pace to something more tolerable. It wasn't over yet. They had their own AI on their side. Justin knew what to do. There was still unfinished business, and Clark wasn't going to let some upstart rogue AI get in the way. "Brace for deceleration," Justin said, after an indeterminate passing of time. "This will be deeply unpleasant." There was a lurch, and Clark was thrust forward in his seat, chest and shoulders digging into the restraints. He'd have bruises, and that was only if blood wasn't drawn. The shuddering was worse than ever, the entire ship shaking uncontrollably in every direction. He felt something crunch painfully in his mouth, and spat the tooth out to avoid swallowing it. Copper taste on its tongue. The cabin was getting warmer. "We are skimming the atmosphere," Justin announced. "I am adjusting our speed and trajectory to avoid reaching inadvertent escape velocity. The turbulence is being caused by our interaction with the Earth's atmosphere, which is simultaneously applying extreme deceleration. We will need to complete multiple orbits to reduce speed sufficiently. The atmospheric interference should prevent, probably better, from being able to close its pursuit distance." Clark was shunted one way and then another, his weight continuously shifting in the seat, the pain of the acceleration replaced with a new form of torture. His body felt as if he'd been in a car crash, and had then had to go several rounds with a heavyweight. He didn't know if he'd be able to even walk once they were down. "Once we have slowed sufficiently, I will perform an emergency landing in Addis Ababa, as near to the portal station as possible. Once we are clear of ionization, I will contact the local authorities to clear the surrounding streets and evacuate the station." Back through the portal then. A return to mid-Earth. Clark found himself grinning in spite of the pain. Mid-Earth would be a welcome relief. They didn't have any damned spaceships there. Thanks for listening. You can find lots more, leave comments, and check out other Triverse stories over on the newsletter at simonkjones.substack.com.